I've got the pleasure of introducing the session on what should the role of international development aid be in shaping the lives in Kenya. I'm very fortunate to introduce this great panel of development experts to share their perspectives to help us navigate the session, and the phrase comes to mind, saving the best till last. I will introduce the panel a bit, but I found it very challenging to summarize the richness of your experience, so please excuse my brevity. So moderating the panel and sitting in the middle is Wairu Kinyori-Gugu. So she's currently works as an independent consultant and has held previous roles as Director of Programs for Oxfam Kenya and the Kenya Development Foundation. She's got an expertise in public policy, gender equality, whoop whoop, and tax justice, just to name a few. And also Wairu will be documenting this session for her blog. And we've also got Ezra Mbogori, who's the Executive Director of the Akiba Uhaki Foundation, which is a human rights and social justice fund in East Africa. He's previously sat on the board of Oxfam South Africa and has held a leadership and advisory roles in a huge range of organizations looking at reducing urban poverty. Ezra also has fellowships from Harvard Kennedy and Kellogg School of Management, I believe. And lastly, we have G.K. Nkunda, who is an economist and public policy specialist. He specializes in public sector reforms, strengthening governance and institutions for over 19 years, including implementing legislative change. To Wairu, I was wondering if you could give us a bit of insight into how and why you joined the field of development. So I'll hand over to Wairu now to maybe kick off.
Thank you, Annika. So welcome to this session. We're really excited. We were told that we have the graveyard shift, but we are happy all the same because this is an exciting topic for all of us, and we've been in the sector for a couple of years, some more than others. But we're really privileged to be here, and karibuni Nairobi and karibuni Kenya. So Ezra, why did you decide to join the sector?
You know, one of those things you say, I don't think I had much choice, you know. I went through university and was basically headed to becoming, actually my mom's dream was that I would be a teacher. And if there's anything I hated, it's the thought of being a teacher. So I go through university, I get posted to a school, and then I hear about this internship that I should apply for. And it was one of those things that happens. I become an intern with an international organization. And in my first 3 months in the internship, it was a 9-month internship, but in the first 3 weeks of that internship, I traveled almost the whole world. You can imagine the culture shock and, you know, just the totally different perspectives I got there. But what was important for me is that during that time, that 3 weeks, what these guys were exposing me was to all the situations of poverty all over the world. I mean, I went, you know, I saw the Great Wall of China, I went to Hong Kong, I went to the Philippines, I went to the US. I ended up in you know, a red line district in Chicago, for instance. So basically it was exposure to human poverty at terrible levels. And so the moment I got back into Kenya, I thought to myself, hey, we've got to do something about this country. I can't afford to be, you know, I cannot believe that there is nothing I can do about these situations, and I don't want to be exposed to this sort of poverty and to know how much it exists in Kenya.
That was it for me. So I'm in the international development space, but pretty much the policy, institutional space, you know, and pretty much also what motivates me is what then needs to be done. I mean, Ezra has a bigger heart than mine, but what needs to be done to improve services. Reason being for those who come from developing countries, the poor totally depend on public services. Totally, like totally. I mean, if it's not working, it means many livelihoods will be destroyed and that kind of a thing. So that's my that's how I found myself here, and it's been a good ride, Yeah, and a bit rough, but it's been 19 years. There's some things that we've been part of, we've contributed. Things change a little bit, but we keep on trying to do what we can do.
I went through my career journey, and at some point after my master's, I made a choice. I said, you know what, I want to work in the development sector because I want to be part of change. And this came really a lot. It was a push came from when we had the post-election violence in 2007, and I just couldn't believe at how helpless that I felt when things were just happening. And I'm those people who, I love Kenya, and many of you have traveled Kenya, and maybe you'll know why I love Kenya. I love Kenya, I love being here, I love Africa, I love everything about Africa, and I was just like, I just need to be part of that change. So basically, I don't know how many of you have interacted with international aid and international development aid. This is a topic that's of passion to the three of us, and we've talked about it. I've talked with GK about it. I've talked to Ezra about it. I've talked to Tim about it many, many times. And so we wanted to have a conversation with, I wanted to bring my friends to have a conversation, but for you to also listen in and share your inputs and your insights at the end. So I came up with a few statistics around how international development aid looks like in Kenya, which was very interesting for me. So Kenya received 3.9 billion of official development assistance in 2020, so 2019-2020. And this is from bilateral donors, so you have your UK government, your US government, etc. You have your multilaterals, you have your, UNICEF, your WFP, etc. And you have your IFIs, your international financial institutions, so your World Bank, your IMF, and your AFDB, your Africa Development Bank. So 3.9 billion, and this is just, well, I don't know how many of you know this, but it's 10%, around 10% of the national budget. And most of it actually goes into government. A lot of the international aid in Kenya goes into government and to support ministries. For the not-for-profit sector, us, all of the ones who are seated here, the NGOs, we received $1.9 billion, right? The resources that went to the NGOs and the resources that went to the government, most of it went to healthcare, and this is especially because of COVID. So there's a big hike in international aid 2019-2020 because of COVID, so went to health. Interestingly, the IFIs, so the World Bank, IMF, etc., are funding a lot of governance and security, education, agriculture, and food security. So that's a lot of where the money that comes to Kenya goes to in international aid. So I just thought I'd just put the stats out there and just quickly ask you guys what you think about it.
The important thing to note from this statistic, other than the global figure, is where it was spent, and not necessarily the 60% going to projects. It's the sector. So when you think of education, relief, disaster management, so you start to see something, one, about just where the world is. When you think of expenditure that donors are putting in resilience, call it the resilience economy. Things are obviously getting bad. So whatever is categorized as relief disaster, you need to see also that is related to the resilience economy in a big way. So when you think of money going into education and health, it needs to tell us something about what then is not working, that then donor funds are needed. I think we need to start seeing them, from a standpoint of where do donors, or which sectors then are. It's not a question of being attractive. Which sectors do donors invest in? And it's very important for livelihoods of those people who live in those areas. So when you think of economic development, it was also a period where the Kenyan economy was liberalizing. And donors were in that space, whether it's the USAs of this world, the FCDUs and the World Bank. So you got to then always start viewing the role of international aid from that standpoint. But obviously, I'm sure as we progress with the conversation, so there's some traditional areas, obviously things have shifted, and then obviously then, international aid will have to change. And I think the conversation today, as you are briefing me, is how do we, in this room, have a very innovative mind on how that needs to shift?
His narration brought back to mind for me was, in very specific terms, for instance, the extent, the dependence of the government on aid, and what that meant, that there are certain things that the government learned to live with and to accept, conditionalities, for instance. And then, as a signal of these changes having happened, these shifts having taken place, during, and this is a particular example from the time of Kibaki, when some of us in the NGO sector, for instance, had learned to depend on the leverage that donors have on government in order to insist on certain things happening, certain changes taking place. And I recall for instance, I was part of a collective of NGOs that were seeking particular policy changes in how the non-governmental sector was structured in this country. And I remember going to demand from the Attorney General and several other places, it was an interesting story, but demanding certain policy shifts, and government saying to us that we can forget any changes happening. Because they said, in fact, donors are becoming much more intransigent, and we are not going to deal with them anymore. Now, what happened around that time was, this was during Moi's time, and somebody will have to explain what Moi's time was and Kibaki's time and all that. But what we were told then is that because donors had become so stubborn, we could not expect those policy changes to happen. What we ended up doing is using our leverage on donors to cause donors to themselves suggest these changes. And so donors were known, for instance, at the Paris Club meeting, were known to come and present to the government the concerns of NGOs that this policy that governs how they are administered needs to change. And government then would come back to us in Nairobi. This was all happening in Paris. But then government came back to us and said, we can see you guys have been talking to your masters and telling them that we need to change this. Come, let's talk about what needs to change, And so we managed to make some of those changes. Now, fast forward to 10, 15 years after that, and Kibaki is in power, and we in the NGO sector tried to use the same trick to get donors to get Kibaki to change certain things. And Kibaki goes at a public event and says, by the way, our economy is in much better shape. Kenyans need to know that they do not need to go to international donors to ask for any changes or even to demand any accountability. They need to be, donors will not make any difference to us. In fact, if Kenyans want the accountability, they're the ones who should be asking us directly for that accountability, because it is their money we are using. It's no longer donor money. So don't anybody come and tell me that because they're a donor, they expect me to account to them any longer. That for me was another major shift, and it was an indication that the Kenyan economy was doing pretty well. Thank you very much. And donors really only are here to sort of humor us every so often, and we only spend a little of their resources. So those kinds of shifts, I think, have happened over time, and have been real weather vanes for what the state of the economy is, and whether donors whether international aid will make a difference or not.